Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we are getting into some, well, pretty huge global economics news with these tariffs that the Trump administration just put into effect.
Yeah, these are some big changes. Lots to unpack here.
Big changes, right. And we've got a really fascinating set of sources to help us understand what's going on. First, we'll be looking at a detailed report from AP News, just to get a sense of the initial reactions from around the world. Then we're going to dive into this report, Tariff Impact, Sectoral Economic Analysis, which, as you can tell from the title, really gets into the nitty-gritty of how different industries are expected to be affected.
Yeah, we're talking winners and losers here, potential ripple effects across the entire economy.
Right. And finally, we're going to look at a pretty strongly worded counter-argument from the Geopolitical Economy report on YouTube, which offers a very different take on the motivations and potential outcomes of all this.
It definitely challenges some of the assumptions and justifications we're seeing in the mainstream coverage.
It does. So your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to understand the immediate shockwaves from these tariffs, the potential long-term consequences for the U.S. and the world, and these really contrasting opinions surrounding this, this significant economic move.
Absolutely. It's not just about understanding what happened, but also why it happened and what it might mean for all of us going forward.
Exactly. Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly did the Trump administration do? According to both AP News and the Tariff Impact Analysis, on April 2nd, 2025, President Trump announced these sweeping new tariffs. Actually, he called it Liberation Day.
Liberation Day.
Yeah, pretty dramatic framing, right? The core of these new tariffs is a baseline 10% tariff on almost all goods imported into the U.S., and this part took effect really quickly on April 5th.
So that's already in place.
Already in place.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They also announced what they're calling discounted reciprocal tariffs on countries with significant trade deficits with the U.S.
Reciprocal tariffs, meaning they're supposed to mirror the tariffs other countries have on U.S. goods, right?
Well, that's how it's usually understood, but that's actually not quite how these are working. These new tariffs kicked in just a few days later, on April 9th, and they aren't directly mirroring other countries' rates. Instead, they seem to be calculated based on the trade deficit with that country, with a quote-unquote discount applied.
So not true reciprocity, then?
Not in the traditional sense. And this is a point that financial journalist James Surowiecki highlighted, and it's something the Geopolitical Economy report really digs into. They argue that the White House's calculation for these so-called reciprocal rates isn't actually based on the existing tariffs that other countries impose on U.S. goods.
That's a pretty significant distinction.
It is. So let's get specific. The Tariff Impact Report lays out the actual numbers. China is now facing a whopping 34% new tariff. And when you add that to the existing 20% tariff that was already in place,
That brings the total to 54%.
54%. Effectively making, making many goods prohibitively expensive.
Yeah.
A huge escalation beyond just a little negotiating tactic.
Right.
The EU is looking at a new 20% tariff. On top of what was already in place, Japan, a new 24%. Vietnam, a staggering new 46%. That's on top of existing tariffs. India, a new 26% plus existing. And the UK, a new 10% plus existing.
Wow. Those are some big numbers.
They are. And Canada and Mexico, surprisingly, are exempt from this new baseline tariff. But any pre-existing tariffs on goods from those countries are still in effect.
Okay, so we've got the breakdown of the tariffs. Now, what about the global reaction?
Yeah, well, AP News paints a pretty vivid picture of widespread shock and dismay among governments and investors. We saw almost immediate threats of retaliation, especially from China and the EU.
Not surprising, given the scale of these tariffs.
Not at all. AP notes that China, they didn't waste any time. They immediately slapped a 34% tax on all U.S. imports. It's a tit-for-tat response, really.
Makes sense.
And the EU promised robust countermeasures. There was even talk from some French officials about targeting U.S. tech giants, specifically with new taxes.
So the potential for a trade war is very real here.
It seems that way. The UK and Japan, on the other hand, seem to be taking a more cautious approach. They've expressed hope for a negotiated settlement and haven't retaliated immediately.
Probably trying to avoid escalating things further, at least for now.
Right. But even without immediate retaliation, the financial markets definitely reacted with some concern.
Yeah, you can't just throw that kind of uncertainty into the global economy without seeing a reaction.
Exactly. Both AP News and the Tariff Impact Analysis point out that global stock markets took a pretty big hit. The S&P 500 dropped 3.7%, the STOXX Europe 600 fell 2.7%, and Tokyo's Nikkei saw a 2.8% decline.
Investors clearly worried that these tariffs are going to disrupt global trade, increase costs for businesses, and ultimately hurt corporate profits.
And AP News also noted a fascinating immediate reaction from U.S. consumers. A rush to buy big-ticket items before the tariffs actually went into effect.
Oh, interesting. So people were anticipating those price increases right away.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
So we've seen what happened, and we've seen the immediate global reaction. Now let's get into the why. What are the reasons behind these tariffs? What's the administration's justification? The Tariff Impact Report tells us the Trump administration's stated goals are, well, they say they want to reverse what they see as unfair treatment from other countries, to bring manufacturing and jobs back to the U.S., and to achieve greater economic independence.
So a classic protectionist argument. Shield American industries from foreign competition, bring back jobs, that sort of thing.
Right. And they're using a declaration of a national economic emergency as the legal justification.
Which, of course, gives the president very broad powers when it comes to trade.
It does.
Yeah.
And they're really framing this as, remember, Liberation Day. They see it as a rebirth of American industry. The Geopolitical Economy Report even included a clip of Trump's announcement where he uses that exact language.
Yeah, I remember that. Very powerful rhetoric.
It is. But the Geopolitical Economy Report offers a very different and much more critical perspective on these justifications. They really go after this idea of reciprocal tariffs, arguing that these new tariffs aren't actually reciprocal at all.
Right. As we discussed, they're calculated based on the trade deficit, not on actual existing tariff rates.
Exactly. And they highlight this point made by James Soroki, who pointed out that the White House's calculation seems to be, it's pretty unusual. They've apparently taken the U.S. trade deficit with each country, divided it by that country's exports to the U.S., and then
applied some sort of arbitrary discount.
Yeah, they actually use the word kindness in their official statement. I know, right? So it seems like instead of saying, okay, country X charges us a 5% tariff, so we'll charge them 5% back, it's based on this idea of trying to wipe out the trade deficit.
Which is, it's a very different approach.
It is. And the White House did initially push back against this criticism. They claim to be taking into account both tariff and non-tariff barriers in their calculations.
Which would make it more complicated than just looking at the trade deficit.
Right. But the Geopolitical Economy Report points out that the White House's own official statement actually contradicts that claim. They admit to using the trade deficit as a proxy because they say it's too difficult to calculate the actual tariffs.
So their defense kind of falls apart there.
Yeah, it does seem that way. And the Geopolitical Economy Report really hammers this point home. They argue that this isn't reciprocity at all. It's an arbitrary system based solely on the U.S. trade deficit. And they suggest that this approach fundamentally misunderstands how international trade works. They say if the U.S. wants to reduce its trade deficit, it needs to export more, not
make it harder for other countries to buy American goods.
Exactly.
And these tariffs will likely lead to more retaliatory tariffs, which would make U.S. goods even more expensive in other countries, potentially making the trade deficit even worse.
Right. So the Geopolitical Economy Report is basically saying this whole thing could backfire spectacularly. But they go even further. They suggest that this might not even be about trade at all. They propose a potentially much more cynical motivation behind these tariffs.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
They argue that the real goal might be to shift the tax burden. Instead of taxing the wealthy and corporations, they're saying the administration wants to tax the working class and the poor.
Whoa. That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. But they make a compelling case. They point out that tariffs are essentially a tax on consumption. And since lower-income individuals tend to spend a larger percentage of their income on goods and services, they would be hit harder by these increased costs.
Makes sense. It's like a regressive sales tax, in a way.
Right. And they point to the Trump administration's push for tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations as further evidence for this theory.
So they're saying it's all part of a bigger plan to reshape the tax system, making it more beneficial to the rich and more burdensome for everyone else.
Yeah, that's their argument. Okay, so let's move on from the motivations and look at the potential consequences. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of how these changes are expected to affect different sectors of the U.S. economy. The tariff impact analysis provides a really in-depth breakdown here, and it paints a pretty complex picture.
It would have to be complex. The economy is a tangled web, and these tariffs are going to pull on a lot of different threads.
Exactly. Let's start with energy.
Okay, energy. How's that sector looking?
Well, the tariff impact analysis predicts a decrease in raw material prices, specifically oil, due to an anticipated reduction in overall demand as a result of the tariffs.
So less economic activity overall means less demand for energy. Makes sense.
But they also note that the existing tariffs on Canadian oil and gas remain.
Right, which could offset some of that price decrease. And Canada is a major energy supplier for the U.S.
It is. Interestingly, though, the energy sector actually shows some resilience in the immediate market reaction.
Yeah, oil prices didn't plummet as much as some might have expected.
Right. The tariff impact report suggests this could be due to a few other factors that are kind of balancing things out. Things like tight global supply and all the geopolitical stuff going on in the world.
Right, so the tariffs are just one piece of the puzzle when it comes to energy prices.
They are. Now, for raw materials, the picture is a bit different. We're talking things like steel and aluminum.
Which are directly affected by the tariffs.
Exactly. And the expectation here is for increased costs. As we discussed earlier, the EU is already responding by tightening its steel import quotas, which is likely to further disrupt global trade in these materials.
So it's a double whammy for U.S. companies that rely on imported steel and aluminum. They're paying the tariffs, and they're facing potentially limited supply.
Exactly. And this all points to higher prices for things like building materials, cars, you name it.
Which means higher costs for consumers.
Right. And speaking of the auto industry, the industrial sector as a whole is looking at some pretty significant challenges. The tariffs impact analysis predicts a big jump in raw material costs for industrial companies, which they say could lead to a $12,000 increase in the price of vehicles.
Oof, that's going to hurt.
It is. There's also a lot of uncertainty about future investment in this sector, and we've already seen the stock of W.W. Grainger, a big industrial part supplier, get downgraded.
So investors are nervous.
Very nervous. And consumer discretionary is another sector that's likely to take a hit. We're talking about things like electronics, cars, clothes, furniture, all those things that people buy when they have extra money to spend.
And with the economy potentially slowing down and prices going up, people are going to have less money to spend on those things.
Right. So this sector is facing a kind of double whammy, higher costs for imported goods and a decrease in demand as those prices go up.
A recipe for trouble.
It is. And we saw consumer discretionary stocks like Amazon decline in response to the tariff announcement. And retailers like RH and Best Buy are being identified as particularly vulnerable.
It's not hard to see why. A big chunk of their products come from overseas.
Right. And even consumer staples, the things we buy every day, aren't immune. The tariff impact analysis points to potential price increases for imported produce from Mexico. Things like avocados, limes, tomatoes.
So groceries could get more expensive?
They could. And the geopolitical economy report highlighted just how reliant the U.S. is on imports for a lot of basic food items. They point out that 99% of coffee is imported, 60% of fruits, 40% of vegetables.
So those tariffs are going to be felt in the produce aisle.
They are.
It seems like it's going to be hard to escape the impact of these tariffs no matter what you're buying.
Yeah, it's looking that way. Now, the healthcare sector is also bracing for impact. They're expecting higher raw material costs for pharmaceuticals, especially those coming from Switzerland. And while the sector initially got a pass, there's a planned investigation that could lead to future tariffs on pharmaceuticals.
Oh, wow. So drug prices could go up too.
They could. And that has a lot of people concerned about the affordability of medication.
It's a big concern, especially for people with chronic illnesses who rely on those medications.
It is. Interestingly, the financial sector doesn't seem to have a direct impact from raw material pricing, but they are expected to suffer indirectly.
How so?
Well, if the tariffs lead to a slowdown in the overall economy, as many experts are predicting, then financial institutions are going to feel it.
Right. Less economic activity means less lending, less investment, all of that.
Exactly. And we've already seen the stock of U.S. Bank downgraded, reflecting those concerns.
Makes sense.
Finally, let's talk about information technology. This sector looks especially vulnerable.
Why is that?
Well, their supply chains are incredibly complex and global.
Right. Smartphones and computers have parts coming from all over the world.
Exactly. So these tariffs are going to mean higher costs for components and finished goods. We've already seen stock declines for companies like NVIDIA, and it's likely that prices for electronics like smartphones and TVs are going to go up. And then there's also the potential for retaliatory tariffs from other countries, which could make things even worse.
Right, like those French officials talking about targeting U.S. tech companies.
Exactly. So across the board, it really does look like U.S. consumers are going to feel the pinch from these tariffs. The tariff impact analysis estimates some pretty significant price increases. For example, they're saying cars could cost anywhere from $2,500 to $20,000 more.
Yikes, that's a big jump.
And the Yale Budget Lab is estimating that the average household could lose $2,100 per year just from these tariffs alone.
That's a significant hit to people's wallets.
It is. And then there's the risk of inflation, which is a major concern. The Yale Budget Lab predicts a 1.3% short-term increase in inflation just from these tariffs.
So everything gets more expensive and people's money doesn't go as far.
Right. And the real worry here isn't just about rising prices, but about the possibility of the economy slowing down at the same time. That combination is called stagflation, and it's a really tough situation to be in.
It is. And as the geopolitical economy report highlighted, we could also see price hikes on everyday staples like coffee, fruits, and vegetables, things that are heavily reliant on imports.
Right. So it's not just about big-ticket items. It's about the cost of basic necessities going up, too.
Which could have a ripple effect throughout the entire economy.
It could. So zooming out to the broader U.S. economy, the tariff impact analysis cites the Yale Budget Lab's projection of a 0.5% drop in GDP growth in 2025. That's a pretty significant slowdown, and all this uncertainty is likely to make businesses hesitant to invest, which could further harm the economy.
Right. Businesses need to feel confident about the future to invest and grow, and these tariffs are creating a lot of uncertainty.
They are. And while the administration argues that these tariffs will bring back jobs, there's a lot of debate about that.
It's a complex issue.
It is. Some experts are worried that we could actually see job losses in sectors that rely heavily on imported goods or that are hit by retaliatory tariffs from other countries.
Right, like if those French tariffs on U.S. tech companies become a reality.
Exactly. And the tariff impact analysis even mentioned the possibility of layoffs at Stellantis, the big auto manufacturer.
But those job losses could be very real.
They could.
Yeah.
And the geopolitical economy report is particularly critical of this idea that tariffs alone will lead to reindustrialization.
It's a very simplistic view.
It is. They argue that without a much more comprehensive state-led industrial policy, these tariffs won't magically bring factories back to the U.S.
So they're saying it's not enough to just slap tariffs on imports. You need a plan to actually build up domestic manufacturing.
Exactly. They point to things like the Biden administration's attempts at industrial policy, the IRA, the CHIPS Act, as examples of what's really needed. And they argue that the Trump administration is actually dismantling those kinds of efforts. They even bring up China's state-led industrial policy, Made in China 2025, as an example of what a successful approach looks like.
So they're saying, look, if you want to compete with China, you need to play the same game.
Right. And finally, let's look at the global implications. The Tariff Impact Report highlights the increased risk of a full-blown trade war. As we've seen, major trading partners are already threatening retaliation.
And those retaliatory tariffs could have a ripple effect throughout the global economy, making everyone worse off.
Exactly. There's also the potential for a weakening of the U.S. dollar, which could further destabilize the global financial system. And companies are going to have to scramble to adjust their supply chains to navigate these new trade barriers.
Right. It's going to be a period of significant disruption.
It is. And the Geopolitical Economy Report points out a kind of contradiction here. They argue that these tariffs could undermine the U.S. dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, even as the Trump administration is threatening countries that try to move away from the dollar.
That's a fascinating point. It seems like they're trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, it's definitely a mixed message. So to sum it all up, these new tariffs represent a really big and complicated shift with immediate global economic consequences. We've talked about how they're expected to impact various sectors of the U.S. economy, potentially leading to higher prices for just about everything and creating a lot of uncertainty for both businesses and consumers. And we've explored the different interpretations of why these policies are being implemented, from the administration's view that this is Liberation Day for American industry, to the critics who warn of a damaging trade war, increased inflation, and a shift in the tax system that could disproportionately impact lower-income Americans. And there are serious questions about whether these so-called reciprocal tariffs are really reciprocal at all, and whether reindustrialization can happen without a much broader, more strategic approach.
We've definitely seen a contrast in viewpoints. On the one hand, you have this narrative of revitalizing American industry and reclaiming American strength on the global stage. And on the other hand, there are real fears about the potential for economic harm, both domestically and internationally, and questions about the true motivations behind these policies.
Exactly. So here's something to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. Given everything we've discussed, the immediate market reactions and the long-term projections, what do you think is the most likely lasting impact of these tariffs on the global economy and on your own personal financial well-being? And what questions does all of this raise for you about the future of international trade and the direction of economic policy in the years to come? This is just the beginning of a very complex story, and we encourage you to keep learning and exploring as the consequences of these tariffs continue to unfold.